Hello and welcome to Lecture 6 on William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And hopefully this is the final lecture. I hope so. Please, Puck, please let this be the final lecture. I do believe in you, Puck. I do believe in Puck. You see, belief in the supernatural, yes, causes a lot of anxiety. You want to placate them fairies. Reminds me of the Cowardly Lion and the Wizard of Oz. I do believe in spooks. I do believe in spooks. So, yes, here we are. Hopefully the final lecture. I have 3 hours. Perhaps I can get the final lecture done in 3 hours. We shall see. So let's turn. We need to finish Act 4 before we move into Act 5. So let's return to Act 4 in your play. And I am on page 1382 in your anthologies. We are going to begin with Bottom's Dream. And this is a very famous passage in the play. Many critics have looked at this and offered their interpretations. And it begins, what line does it begin on? Well, I'm going to begin at line 203. I'm going to begin there on page 1382. This is Act 4, Scene 1, the end of Scene 1. And remember, Bottom awakens. Everyone has exited the stage. Theseus and Hippolyta, the young lovers. Before them, Titania and Oberon and Puck, all the fairies. There's nobody left on stage except Bottom. And Bottom awakens. He still imagines that he's behind the shrubbery waiting for his cue. He still thinks he's with his working men practicing the play that they hope to perform before Theseus and Hippolyta on their wedding day. But then he suddenly realizes this moment between dreaming and waking, this moment between dreaming and waking, things you aren't quite certain. Are you still dreaming? Are you awake? And that reminds me of the lovers at the top of the page here. I looked at my last lecture yesterday evening, and I don't know if I explained this passage very well. I'm not sure if I understood it very well. I think I do now, though, after looking at it. The lovers awaken, and when they refer to these things at the top of the page 1382, when Demetrius says, these things seem small and undistinguishable, he's referring to what has just occurred. Theseus pardoning Hermia and Lysander, Aegeus' will being overturned, Theseus and Hippolyta, and the young lovers are now to have a triple wedding. That's what these things are referring to. And so Demetrius, he can't know for certain. It feels like it must be a dream. All is working out beautifully for us. I love Helena, she loves me, Lysander and Hermia, they love each other, and now we're off to be married. And so it feels like a dream, and he's wondering, am I still dreaming? Am I awake? And Hermia, of course, says as well, methinks I see these things with parted eye. She as well, her vision isn't 20/20 yet. She's not quite certain. Am I awake? Lysander does indeed love me, and we are to be married. And Helena says, and I have found Demetrius like a jewel, mine own and not mine own. I mean, this idea, is this reality? Are we still in La La Land? Because suddenly Demetrius has pronounced in front of Theseus and the world that he loves me and only me. And Demetrius says, are you sure that we are awake? It seems to me that yet we sleep, we dream. So again, this question, are we awake? Are we dreaming? Because they have just awakened, haven't they? Just prior to this moment in the play, this passage here in the play, Do not you think the Duke was here and bid us follow him? And Hermia says, Yea, and my father, and Helena, and Hippolyta. And Lysander, and he did bid us follow to the temple. And then Demetrius concludes, Why then, we are awake. Let's follow him, and by the way, let's recount our dreams. So, it takes a moment between that, area between sleeping, dreaming, and waking. If the dream, you imagine the dream, the ocean, you're off in the ocean's dream, and the shore represents reality. Well, the edge of the shore between the ocean and the land, where the waves keep coming in and moving out and moving in and moving out. This is that period between dreaming and waking when you aren't quite certain which is which. Are you awake or are you dreaming? It's interesting that Demetrius says, and by the way, let's recount our dreams. On the way back to Athens, let's recount our dreams. So here is where the indication is that there's this suggestion here, and we'll see at the beginning of Act 5, that Demetrius is already imagining that what occurred in the past, in the night before, perhaps it was a dream. Perhaps it wasn't real. The way that the young lovers were behaving, remember how abusive they were towards each other, both verbally, they call each other horrible names, and physically as well. So this moment, this period here, but already you see this, just an indication here that perhaps they, like Titania, are going to try to rationalize their way out of the night before, out of their misbehavior. Just as Titania, upon her awakening, oh, what visions have I seen? Methought I was enamored of an ass. So this is that moment again between reality and the dream world, between sleep and waking. And Shakespeare's at pains here to say that this is the only period, this moment between, that is when one has this double vision, or when one says, like far-off mountains turned into clouds. You're not quite sure. Mountains, clouds, dream, wake, which is it? But, and that's the way it is in reality, isn't it? Because when we are dreaming, we're not aware that we're dreaming. It feels real. It's an illusion, but it feels real. It feels as if that dream world is the real world. Just as a Midsummer Night's Dream, right? It's all an illusion. It's a fiction. But, and again, at that moment of awakening, again, there's this, am I awake or am I still dreaming? But the more and gradually, the more and more one begins to awaken, one realizes one isn't in a dream. Why is that? Because the real world, things become clearer and clearer, sharper and sharper, and more lucid. And you discover, oh my, this is the real world. I've got to get up out of bed. I've got to go write my essay on A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the more you become awake, the more reality sets in and begins to weigh you down. And you've got to go to school, and you've got to go to work, and then you've got all sorts of obligations that need to be met that day. And your brain is in pain. It's in a state of dissatisfaction. It has needs that must be met. And so you are motivated to get out of bed. I mean, you might lie in bed, but after a while, boredom sets in, and boredom, that's really painful. Boredom can be exceptionally painful. And so again, the brain in pain, it has to escape that boredom. It has to seek entertainment, pleasure, that carrot, that illusion. which is just a removal of that whip of boredom. So I think I have analyzed this passage correctly here. And of course, this leads to Bottom's dream. And when Bottom awakes, he thinks at first, he's imagining that he is still listening for his cue to come onto stage, the grassy stage in the woods, to perform his part of Pyramus in the play Pyramus and Thisbe, that again the working men wish to perform for the Duke and the future Duchess Hippolyta. But gradually Bottom does realize he's where he is, and then he recalls his dream. But Bottom's dream, Bottom is aware that he is awake now. That he's no longer in the dream world. And it's then that he recalls his dream. But it was a dream, and he's aware of that. It was a dream, and he talks about his dream here, beginning at around line 203. And look what he says. I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream, past the wit of man to say what dream it was. Man is but an ass if he go about to expound upon this dream. Methought I was, there is no man can tell what. Methought I was, and methought I had, but man is but a patched fool if he will offer to say what methought I had. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen. Man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was. I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream, because it hath no bottom. And I will sing it in the latter end of a play, before the Duke. Peradventure, to make it the more gracious, I shall sing it at her death. And he exits the stage. What's going on here? How should we interpret this passage? Well, I'm going to argue that once again, Shakespeare is returning to this romantic view that holds, subscribes to a belief in the supernatural. A supernatural world populated by supernatural beings and supernatural places are also within this realm. And all sorts of supernatural phenomena, magical flower juice, magical antidotes, the power of invisibility, the power to shapeshift. All of these miracles that, of course, deny the law of identity, that deny the law of causality, deny the law of inevitability, all these scientific laws that we're stuck with in the world, the physical world, the world of reality, the world we inhabit here. And so Shakespeare is returning to this idea of the supernatural, because belief in the supernatural, was thinking about it, belief in the supernatural really is, when you think about it, it is the bedrock of the romantic view. It is the bedrock of that view. And we also see it in the comic optimist, the comic plot line that the comic optimist subscribes to, the comic optimist upholds. The idea of a happy ending, a happily ever after ending, and the idea that life is essentially good, let's continue on with life, this promise of a happy ending, a happily ever after ending. There's the suggestion there of a supernatural world in that notion. And then, of course, many, many romantics believe, particularly romantics of a religious belief, a religious faith. They imagine a paradise to come, a heaven to come. Even those who are of a non-religious faith, they imagine that consciousness or some spirit or some essence within that is non-physical will survive the death of the physical body, and therefore death ultimately can be conquered, will be conquered. And so that's what Shakespeare's doing here in this passage. Because the realist is going to remind us again of the problems of belief in the supernatural. You've got the problem of definition, the problem of origin, the problem of interaction, and of course there simply is no evidence, no scientific evidence of a supernatural realm. How could there be? Science, of course, deals with the natural world. It makes observations in the world we find ourselves in. And of course, if there isn't any scientific evidence to support a belief in a supernatural realm, then we can have no philosophical truths that that scientific data points to, because there is no scientific information, no scientific data. So no philosophical truth concerning the existence of the supernatural world can be attained. And in fact, the very word supernatural itself, super meaning above and beyond, the supernatural world, if it were to exist, which the realist says it doesn't, beyond a rational doubt, it's simply a figment of the romantic's imagination. It's what he or she, the stories he or she has listened to at mama's knee growing up. And most people in the world subscribe to this belief. Everybody believes it, so it must be true. And of course, we find in our culture that most people are indoctrinated into this belief when they are children, when they are not rational, when they cannot think scientifically or philosophically, and so they find themselves believing in a supernatural realm. So we have these problems, super, above, and beyond the natural world. That suggests that it's above and beyond, if it were to exist, it would be above and beyond the ability of human beings to comprehend, to understand. How could they? How could they possibly understand anything about a supernatural world? It's above and beyond human comprehension. What could you say about it? That's a big problem, isn't it? So, this notion itself of the supernatural, we can add that to our list of reasons, of proof that the supernatural world beyond a rational doubt, B-A-R-D, and that spells Bard. Remember, beyond a rational doubt, B-A-R-D, we have the acronym, and Bard, of course, is the term that's often applied to Shakespeare, the Immortal Bard. Of course, Shakespeare, not immortal. He's only survived, what? His name alone has survived his plays, what, about a little over 400 years? I wonder where he'll be in 1 billion or so years from now. But at any rate, here is one more nail in the coffin, as if we needed another nail in this coffin called the supernatural realm. But there are some romantics who will put forward an argument nevertheless, and that's what this passage is touching on, I would argue, because Shakespeare doesn't want to leave any room for any arguments, ultimately. His concern, again, he's not concerned with whether the supernatural realm exists or not, because again, if it did, how would anybody have access to it? How could anybody know anything of the supernatural world? What he is concerned about is people's belief in that world and their certainty that it exists. And that certainty, that irrational belief, leads to all kinds of unethical behavior, particularly when a lot of people come together and form a kind of cult that becomes a religion, and all that power, all that might can make right, and people will impose their particular religious beliefs on others if they have enough power. We've seen it happen again and again. And Shakespeare is particularly concerned with the Christian religion. He's living in Elizabethan England at a time when Christianity rules throughout Europe and is now, it's moving beyond European borders, and it's crossing over the Atlantic into the New World, the North American and South American and continents, and Central America as well. So Shakespeare is concerned with this belief in the supernatural world, and so what he's doing here is he's going to he wants to shut this door on this belief in the supernatural, and here this is what he's doing in Bottom's Dream, I would argue. So romantics will make counter arguments, and I'm going to look at the three primary arguments that they make, because these are the three most important I believe, and you're welcome to look at other arguments, but the realist has explored these arguments, and ultimately all these philosophical arguments that are made or scientific evidence is put forward, and it's all none of these arguments ultimately, or none of the proof that's put forward ultimately it stands or is sound. The scientific evidence doesn't stand, and the philosophical arguments are not sound. But at any rate, the first argument that romantics will make is the argument of personal testimony, the notion of revelation. It's the idea that someone witnesses a supernatural being. And this can be, first of all, an indirect revelation. So, for example, one can witness an angel who is a kind of emissary of a god. In Greek mythology, Hermes was the messenger of the gods. Of course, he was a god himself. In the Christian religion, you have the idea of angels that come to the earth, and they come to the earth as emissaries, as agents of the Christian God. So you have this idea of an indirect revelation, and also you have this idea of a direct revelation, the idea that a supernatural being, whatever god or gods, appears him or herself before you. In this case, Bottom, remember, he has witnessed Titania. Titania has appeared before him. Nobody else in the play witnesses these supernatural beings. Of course, the working men, Puck, shapeshifts and frighten the working men. But we've seen that symbolic of this notion, again, of belief in the supernatural. You're in the dark, in the woods, you can't see clearly, and of course you already hold this belief in the supernatural, so you see something, you hear a noise, oh, it must be a ghost, when it's just the wind blowing through the trees. Or you see something, a shadow, and you say, oh, it must be Puck, when what it really is just a bear. So you can see people who hold these beliefs, when they, something mysterious, some sort of mysterious occurrence, some going on in their vicinity, and they're not sure just what was that. And they make that leap of faith into a supernatural explanation. But remember, it has no explanatory power. So this idea of a direct revelation, where the supernatural entity appears before you, the god or the gods himself, or in Bottom's case, Titania. I was trying to think of other indirect revelations. Yeah, you do have indirect revelations where people imagine the statues crying, and that's a kind of indirect revelation that the supernatural world exists. Or you see in your grits, you see the God's face in your grits. That's the God in the grits, not the God in the gap, but the God in the grits. So you say, a God exists, and now you've got a God of the gaps. You filled in that gap with a God, and now you've got the Grand Canyon gap you're going to have to fill in. So yeah, the God in the grits, that's proof. So you can see how these arguments concerning concerning revelations, you can see how they really, it depends on someone's personal testimony, and that's just not enough. That kind of testimony is not going to hold up in a court of law, is it? Particularly if you're positing a supernatural the existence of a supernatural being. That's an extraordinary claim you're making. A supernatural being. An extraordinary claim. And so you need extraordinary proof. It can't be, well, you know, my mama told me, or my best friend said he saw a ghost, so ghosts exist, or, well, there's a show on TV called Ghost Hunters, so ghosts must exist. I watch the show every week. No, these personal testimonies, you can see how they just don't, they aren't enough. They're not going to stand up in a rational court of law. You can imagine a defense attorney, and he says, despite all the evidence against my client, despite the fact that the prosecutor has a glove that fits the hand of my client, and despite the fact that the prosecutor has a picture of a bloody footprint that is the same size and same make of shoe that my client wears, and the same size foot as my client's foot, and despite the fact that the prosecutor has evidence on tape that my client was abusive to his wife, physically abusive to his wife, and that she had to resort to calling the police on several occasions, despite the fact that the prosecutor has presented filmed evidence of my client fleeing from the police, and despite the fact that the prosecutor has put forward this notion that my client had the time and the opportunity and the means and the motive, no, you know what? My client is innocent. I have proof. It was the invisible man who did it. The invisible man who did it. No. The invisible man? The invisible man is the murderer? Not the husband of this woman? No. No, that invisible man don't fit. If the invisible man explanation don't fit, you can't acquit. The invisible man, because what's an invisible man? Where did an invisible man come from? How does an invisible man interact with the real world, the physical world? Where's your evidence of this invisible man? That's an extraordinary claim you're making. You need some extraordinary proof to back that up. You can't just say, it was the invisible man. I saw the invisible man. So you can see the problem with this idea of revelation. This extraordinary claim that people make. And so many people, as I said, they're ready to make that leap of faith and to fill in that gap, that mystery, with a supernatural explanation. But the realist says, well, you know, before you leap, you might want to take a second look, because that's a pretty big Grand Canyon you're going to have to leap over. You might just fall down in there, in that Grand Canyon, and never find your way out. So let's consider rational possibilities for this mystery that has occurred. I mean, after all, you could have dreamed it. People dream. It happens. Some people dream and they imagine that in that period between waking, between dream and reality, they imagine the existence of some supernatural being. You could have dreamed it and just not have realized it was a dream. People drink a lot. A lot of people drink a lot. You might have drunk a little too much. Maybe you'd start to see things. That's a natural explanation. Some people take drugs. Maybe you just had a little too much marijuana. Or maybe you're on something stronger. And, you know, what might you see then? What might you imagine then under the influence of a more powerful drug? And, of course, you may have just had a temporary moment of delusion when, you know, a temporary break with the real world. That's possible. People do have delusional episodes. They lose contact. They lose touch with reality temporarily. They become delusional. Some people become deranged. They become mad. We're going to hear about the madman at the top of Act 5. Perhaps this person's deranged, this person who's claiming that the devil told him to do it. I'm remembering the son of Sam, the serial killer, who said his doggies told him to do it. The demons were speaking through his doggies, or I don't know if it was his doggies, but doggies somewhere. The doggies told him to do it. So yeah, some people are deranged. You could just be in the dark, you don't know, and you're determined that it be a supernatural explanation, again, because of how you were raised. You already hold a belief in the supernatural, so how easy is it for you? You're determined to make it a supernatural explanation because you're already holding that particular belief. It could be that somebody's just dumb in the sense they're ignorant. They're just ignorant. They're not educated. They don't understand. They've never studied science. They don't understand, the scientific method and what we mean by a scientific theory or a scientific law. They've never really, they don't understand much of anything about physics or chemistry or biology or evolution or all the other sciences around them, genetics, geology, all these other sciences, astronomy, all these other sciences as well, but particularly the big three. They just don't have much of an understanding, if any understanding at all, of physics or chemistry or biology, which, of course, the biggest branch of biology is the evolutionary branch, and that explains our origins. We can trace our origins all the way back. So it could be that someone is just dumb in the sense they've never been exposed, they've never had an education, and so they're ignorant. And so they're going to be more likely to posit a supernatural explanation. Or it could be that you're just watching a drama. I mentioned the ghost hunters on TV. A lot of people, they watch that drama and they say, oh, well, ghosts must exist. I saw it on TV. Fairies must exist. I read it in Shakespeare's play. And Shakespeare, he's an authority, ain't he? He ought to know. But no, it's a fiction. It's a fiction here. And Shakespeare is looking at these fairies and these other supernatural phenomena. He's looking at them symbolically. He's using them for a purpose. He has a point he wishes to make about this belief in the supernatural world. So this idea that, I read it in a book. I saw it on TV, or, I saw images on my screen on the computer of a ghost. Oh, come on, that's rather shaky, isn't it? So there are these other rational explanations. Consider those first. And of course, the biggest explanation, the biggest of all the rational explanations is you've been duped. Somebody's playing a prank on you. Some punk is playing you for a fool, a dupe. A lot of people make a lot of money playing others for fools, right? Come here and I'll read your fortune, says the fortune teller. Yes, the astrologer. Yes, pay me a little money and I'll show you your whole life. I'll read you. I'll put these tarot cards on the table and I'll read your future for you. Come on, hand over a little money. And your future's in the cards. So we have these tricksters out there, these punks, these pranksters who are scheming for themselves. They're interested in making a little bit of money, and that could extend, to people in positions of authority. I'm thinking of religious authorities. They're making a rather good living off all these people believing in the supernatural world. So it could be that you are being fooled. The magician, you believe that the lady has really, the assistant, I called her a lady, that's what she's called on the stage, the magician's assistant, the female, the woman, the assistant, you really do believe she was sawed in half, but the magician, he's got you tricked. That's an illusion. That's not reality. You know what would happen if that woman were sawed in half on the stage. So, yeah, you've got this problem. And the realist says, before you make that leap, watch out, because you're just not going to explain anything. Instead, be rational. Try to find a rational explanation for that particular belief. And then the third argument that many romantics make, and again, this can be somewhat of a religious belief in the supernatural, a religious viewpoint, or someone who is non-religious but nevertheless subscribes to the idea of a supernatural world and supernatural beings existing within that world, is a book. I read it in this book. And by this time, what I mean this kind of book is a particular book that, for religious people, they believe it to be a holy book or a sacred book that is proof positive that their God or gods exist. And we have a lot of so-called sacred or holy books, depending on the religion a person subscribes to. And of course, all of these books make extraordinary claims within. There are gods and angels and devils and seas parting and, there are all kinds of, great floods and so forth. All these kinds of miraculous phenomena occurring within these books. Extraordinary claims are being made, and the claims are in a book. And then the second problem is you have all these various stories. These books are filled with stories, right? You don't open these books and find any scientific data supporting this belief in the supernatural, whichever God that particular book is, supporting, is upholding his or her existence. Most of them are male. But not only do you, this idea of, you have all these stories that make these extraordinary claims, but you have these various stories from these different religions that conflict. Which one is correct? And most people say, well, it's the one I was brought up on. It's the one my parents believe in, my mom and daddy believe in. Imagine if you're of a particular religion, imagine being born in another place or another time. Imagine being born in ancient Greece. Very likely, since most people were romantics in ancient Greece and they believed that the Greek gods truly did exist, well, if you've been born then at that time and place, more than likely you would have been raised to be a romantic and you would believe in Zeus and the other Greek gods. And these stories contradict these various books, these religious texts, these holy, so-called holy or sacred texts contradict one another. But nevertheless, the romantic will put forward a philosophical argument, and the argument goes like this, beginning, remember, I'll put it in the form of a syllogism so you can think about it, and you are certainly welcome to come up with your own philosophical argument or your own scientific evidence. If you're disagreeing with what I'm saying, that can be an extra credit point. You can earn an extra credit if you disagree with the argument that I'm making today. Offer a counter argument. Remember, ultimately, what matters most is not who wins the argument, but arriving at a philosophical truth. Coming to a better understanding of just who we are and where we are so that we can know what to do with ourselves in the world while we're briefly here on this planet, how to be most productive, how to be most functional in the world. How can you be efficient while you're here? Spider-Man, Superman, the Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, right? How can you become the superhero? And so you're really competing, aren't you, with, not with other people. It isn't a contest between who's the best singer or who has more money or who is prettier. and those contests are trivial and unimportant. You're really competing with this idea of you wanting to be a person of intellectual character and ethical decency. You want to be an alpha thinker. And if you arrive at a rational, sound, philosophical truth on that issue, you are now an alpha thinker. And that's the one you're competing with. That's the real contest going on. Because we all fall short. We can all become better and better and greater alpha thinkers. We can go out there and engage with the world and make these arguments and these counter-arguments, but that's the one we're competing with. That alpha thinker we could be. Imagine you, the alpha thinker. When you go to sleep tonight, look up at the ceiling and there you are, the alpha thinker. You don't want to be a beta thinker. Alpha. Not beta, alpha. That'll feed your ego, baby. It is ultimately, you just can't get rid of the beast, the ego. But at least now, right, the beast, he's being directed in a particular way toward productivity, as I said earlier, toward this better thinking. The more rational you become, the more ethical you become. The better behaved you become, the less you'll misbehave. The alpha thinker, you know an alpha thinker when you see one on the highway, that's the one going the speed limit. Anybody going over the speed limit? Anybody getting on the highway not using the blinker? Anybody cutting other people off? Anybody tailgating? Anybody getting on the highway drunk? Well, that's worse than beta thinking. The drunks on the highway. But all the others are beta thinkers. They can't add 1 + 1 = 2. And you can see on the highway, most people are beta thinkers. They aren't alpha thinkers. So your mission is to become the alpha thinker and to spread that word. You want more alpha thinkers on that highway. It's a safer highway. Safer for you, safer for others. All of you could be harmed. You want alpha thinkers everywhere in the world. So back to this idea, this philosophical argument that the romantic puts forward. I have 3 hours. The major premise. So let's put the argument in the form of a syllogism, just a fancy word for, the little formula where you add the scientific data and you arrive at a philosophical truth. 1 + 1 = 2. So the first piece of science, the first scientific fact that romantics will offer to support their particular sacred text. And let's use the Christian text because Shakespeare's concerned primarily with Christianity, but of course, when I use the Christian text, you can imagine any sacred text. Rather than the Bible, you can imagine the Tanakh, and rather than the Tanakh, you can imagine the Quran, or what is the one for the Hindus, the Gita. I can't remember the full name. You'll have to look that up. But anyway, any religious text you can plug into this syllogism. So the major premise goes that the romantic makes to support his belief in the Christian God. The Bible, this is the major premise, the Bible was written by the prophets. Scientific fact. And the second, the minor premise, so we have the major premise, the minor premise, the prophets were inspired by the Christian God. They believe that to be a scientific fact. Of course, now we see the problem sneaking in, don't we? So if you believe that the Bible was written by the prophets, and if you believe that the prophets were inspired by the Christian God, then you can conclude the Christian God does exist. But you can see the problem already, can't you? Because you're trying to prove in your conclusion that the Christian God exists. And you've already assumed the Christian God exists in your minor premise, that the prophets were inspired by the Christian God. You can't do that. The branch of logic in philosophy known as logic says that's called begging the question. And that's where you assume in one of your premises, in this case, the Christian God, what you're trying to prove in your conclusion. So in your premise, you're assuming already that the Christian God exists so that you can prove in your conclusion that the Christian God exists. So you think you're adding 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2. I've arrived at a truth. I've got this holy book here, the Christian Bible, and that's proof that the Christian God exists. But what you really added is the 2, the conclusion you're trying to get at, on this side of the equation, the philosophical truth. You think you've added 1 plus 1, but what you've really added, you've already proved, you think you've already proved, or rather you're sneaking in, if you will, on this side of the equation, what you're trying to prove on this side. So instead of 1 plus 1 equals 2, you've got 1 plus 2 equals 2. And I will agree with you that 1 plus 1 equals 2. That's logical. I can't help but believe that. That's beyond a rational doubt. No person of intellectual integrity is going to challenge that. But to say that 1 plus 2 equals 2, well, you can say 1 plus 2. The rational person is going to say 1 plus 2 equals 2. I think you're confused there. That's not rational. You snuck in what you're trying to prove. On this side of the equation, maybe you just don't understand, but you got it on this side, what you're trying to prove on that side. And so now you got 1 plus 2 equals 2. That's just not going to work. But you know little Jimmy, you remember little Jimmy? He likes to argue. Just like Bottom's ego. He's always going to put forward that kind of argument, isn't he? In one way or another, either directly or indirectly. He's always going to be the naysayer. Nay. So little Jimmy's going to say, yeah, but I've got this book called 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And it was written right here, you'd see, by Clement Clark Moore. Clement Clark wrote this book. And he was inspired to write this book by Santa Claus. He was inspired. He even told me so. I talked to Clement Clark. He told me he was inspired by Santa. Well, that proves Santa exists. Well, you got the same argument, don't you? That's a problem. You've got the same argument that 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, which is my favorite book around Christmas time growing up. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas was written by Clement Clark. And Clement Clark was inspired by Santa. Therefore, Santa exists. So again, you've got 1 plus 2 equals 2. You've got what you're trying to prove, Santa exists over here on this side of the equation. Little Jimmy, look what you've done. You say over here that Clement Clark was inspired by Santa, but you haven't proved yet that Santa exists, so how can you say he was inspired by Santa? You're trying to prove he exists over here. Let's give you one more. You could say that the nursery rhymes were written by the poets. By the way, prophet, you know, the Christian Bible was written by the prophets. Prophets is an ancient word for poet. It doesn't suggest, originally it didn't suggest someone who could, see above and beyond into the supernatural. It was originally a poet. So anyway, back to this third argument. You could say the nursery rhymes were written by the poets. And that's your major premise, your minor premise. The poets were inspired by Mother Goose. Therefore, in my conclusion, I've got my major minor premise all set up nicely in a row, 1 plus 1. Therefore, Mother Goose exists. Mother Goose exists? You can see you've got a problem. That's an extraordinary claim, of course, but you've got a problem in the argument again. Because, once again, you're assuming in your minor premise what you are trying to prove in your conclusion. And so you end up with belief in Mother Goose. That's the problem. Beyond a rational doubt, Mother Goose don't exist. despite the fact we have a book called Mother Goose's Nursery Rhymes. So that's the third problem here. That the realist is going to, or the third argument here that many romantics will put forward. And as I said, they make other arguments, but all of the arguments they make, and you're welcome to go out and do this research on your own, this would make a really good essay for option C, for those of you who do like writing arguments and prefer that, and you've got some experience under your belt from English Composition 1. That's one of the reasons why I include option C. You're welcome on one of these two assignments to write an argument. So you can go out and do the research and look at other philosophical arguments made by romantics or other scientific evidence that romantics have put forward as proof. Again, the realist is going to argue that it's going to be a waste of neurons, but you have to find out for yourself, right? Because you ultimately have to be the authority figure when it comes to these arguments. You have to arrive at these decisions, these truths yourself. You can't just believe something because somebody tells you to. And remember, I've told you before, I ain't that kind of teacher. Just because I say, here's the argument, here's what I believe, because I'd be, a hypocrite to put forward this argument and say, it's not what I believe. But obviously, I'm ultimately concerned with finding the philosophical truths in the world, and I welcome counter arguments. You're not going to offend me any. So bring it on. Let's do it. Let's both become alpha thinkers in the process, because it doesn't matter who wins this argument in the end, ultimately, if we find a philosophical truth. Then we both become alpha thinkers. Then we both become winners. Unlike in the real world, only one person becomes the American Idol singer. And all the others, think of their lives, all the time and energy and money, all the dreaming they did. Think of the Olympic athlete who trips or breaks a leg on the day before, trips and breaks a leg the day before the Olympics. All those years of waste. And for every one gold medal winner, there are all the untold numbers of losers. Lots of losers in these other games, these silly, trivial games. There aren't any losers, 0 losers, in the game of let's find the philosophical truth. Let's especially find these most important philosophical truths. Nobody loses, not you, not me. Because philosophical truths are rational, and rational people are little jackasses. Even those who are addicted, they can still be rational. Still be rational and just say, I'm sorry, I'm addicted, I can't get over my addiction. But it is a philosophical truth. It is a philosophical truth. And so I will speak out, even though I'm addicted. You can grandfather me out, and my addiction can die with me. And hopefully the next generation won't be addicted, because I'm going to speak out against my addiction. Anyway, so why again? All this necessary background, all this necessary information. Well, bottom string in this play is Shakespeare's most direct attack. Is his most direct attack on belief in the supernatural, and particularly an attack on Christian belief in a Christian supernatural world, and that's what he's doing here. So, let's return to the text here, and I'm at line 203 or say. Let's go back. Bottom says, I have had a most rare vision, and again, rare vision. Notice rare, extraordinary. Bottom's already aware that this vision he had, this idea, his revelation, his being with the fairy queen, Titania, the queen of the fairies, that's a rare vision. That's extraordinary. He's come into contact with the supernatural world. That's what his dream was about. I have had a dream. And again, notice Shakespeare is emphasizing that Bottom is aware it was a dream. This rare vision. He's not making that leap to a belief in Titania. Bottom's awake now. He's fully conscious now. He's no longer in that state between the dream state and the waking state. He's no longer at the edge of the ocean there, between the land of reality and the oceanic depths of the dream world. So Bottom says here, I have had a dream. And look what he says. It's past the wit of man to say what dream it was. It's past the wit of man to say what dream it was. Man, you and me, inhabiting the physical world, we can't possibly say anything about the supernatural world if it were to exist. Nobody could say anything about it. It's past our ability to know, past our wit. We can't know anything about a supernatural world. Nobody can know anything about it. It's above and beyond. That's what it means, above and beyond human comprehension. So how could anybody know anything about it if it were to exist? If it did exist, well, just ignore that fact and go about your business, because you can't know anything. Not a dadgum thing about it. It's past the wit of man to say what dream it was. And then look what Bottom says, man is but an ass. And again, Shakespeare having fun with this word ass. You know, Bottom's head was changed into that of a jackass, but now here, Shakespeare reminded of Bottom's head being changed into that of a jackass, but Bottom didn't realize that. That's why this is funny. In Bottom's dream, which was a fiction, let's keep that in mind, but when he met Titania, he didn't realize he had the head of an ass. We can't see our heads. We're headless. And if Bottom had seen his head, he probably would have fainted in horror. I know I would if I looked in the morning. You know, I know I see a jackass in the mirror every morning, but I'm speaking figuratively. I'm a jackass, okay? That's the first thing I say. Don't be a jackass today. But if I were to wake up and go and look in the mirror and say, oh my, if I literally had the head of a jackass, well, you could just imagine how frightened I would be. Because I'm like the Cowardly Lion. It's tough for me. I try, but it's tough. It's scary, speaking up and making arguments. So this idea of seeing the jackass. And it's interesting. I was thinking of the portrait of Dorian Gray. I can't remember. I think some philosopher mentioned this notion. It's very fascinating, the idea, Dorian, he has this painting of himself, and it's put away in his attic because it's a supernatural painting. And when Dorian misbehaves, nothing happens to him. He remains physically, he still has that innocent look of youth. But the picture changes, it alters, and it shows the corruption in the wrinkles that begin to appear, and the sneer on the mouth, and the eyes that become darker and more demonic in appearance. But it's hidden away. And Dorian never ages. The portrait ages, and with time, because Dorian forever remains young and energetic and healthy and sexual, he's out there committing all kinds of harms and getting away with it because he's never affected by it, never changes him in any way. He can't be harmed. But his picture turns into just monster, the monster that's released. Dorian's desires release the monster. Only Dorian doesn't pay any of the consequences. But this philosopher was saying, what a shame that the picture had to be put away in the attic. If Dorian had to wear that picture around his, big picture, like a big billboard sign, if he had to wear that around London town so everyone could see his misbehavior. Imagine each of us having our pictures, a big billboard of us, a painting of us, hanging on us. And every time that our desires trumped our ability to reason, Every time that we cause harm to others because our own needs were more important, because we're selfish. We are. I mean, it's the ego. We are selfish. We are vain. We want what we want. We will take it when the opportunity arises. We have to be careful. We have to keep that horse. We have to keep the wild animal in us. We have to be a rider, a master of that horse. Reason rules the beast. But imagine if we had to wear that around. That painting of us, big painting of us, like a big billboard, advertising billboard. This is who we are. People might very quickly start behaving. But at any rate, so this idea back in the passage, he says, man is but an ass if he go about to expound upon this dream. So in other words, anybody who starts speaking about the supernatural world is an ass. Don't believe them, because they don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea. They have no evidence, no proof, no scientific evidence, no philosophical truths to present to you. So anybody who starts talking about a supernatural world and supernatural beings and supernatural places, Shakespeare's saying right here, he's punning on that word. That person's an ass. That person's going to cause trouble. Particularly if he starts convincing other people. That person is an irrational thinker, and that irrational thinking can have dangerous consequences, as we've mentioned in Shakespeare's time. Dangerous consequences, particularly when a lot of people start believing in it. Then they become powerful. Might makes right. If you're in a dark alley and you're all alone and 2 people are against you, oh, the odds aren't in your favor. 3 people against you, you can see what the problem is. That's one of the reasons why in evolution we came together. It won't love. We came together as tribes because those conscious sentient organisms that came together as tribes, they had a better chance of not being harmed, not experiencing that pain thing. 2 is superior than 1 when it comes to a fist fight. Yeah. Love, power, might, safety, get away from that harm. And so those organisms that did collect into tribes, they're one of the 1% of all the species on the planet that have existed. 100%, 99 are gone, dead, horrific ways. They didn't survive. And some of those species didn't survive because they didn't group. They didn't have the might makes right, the power. Man is but an ass. And notice he's an ass if he goes to talk about it. Man is but an ass if he go about to expound this dream. I think Shakespeare's saying something really interesting here. That is, if you believe, if you are a believer, if you subscribe to whatever religion, or if you believe, if you're non-religious but you believe in, horoscopes and astrology and all that stuff, fine. That's not a problem. If that's your belief, that's your addiction, for whatever reason, because you were raised on it or you just need it in your life, fine. But do that belief thing behind closed doors. Don't tell anybody about it. Especially don't tell the next generation about it. But don't go around telling people. Don't go around advertising that you believe. You're just an ass there. If you hold that belief, you could be a very little jackass. So Shakespeare's saying, don't give up. He's not saying don't give up your faith if you have a faith, whatever that faith might be in. And you're just addicted and can't get over it, you don't have to give it up. But just do it quietly. Do it in your bedroom at night. Close the door. Don't even let Honey Bunny see it. If that's where you got to go, get down on your knees and try to placate whatever God, do it there in the bedroom behind closed doors. Fine. But to go out and preach it, to become a missionary, to speak on it, Shakespeare don't like that idea. That's what this play's saying here. Man is but an ass if, he says, he goes out to preach it, this belief in the supernatural world, to expound on it. He says next, methought I was, there is no man can tell what. And a lot of critics want to fill this in with, methought I was, a jackass. Methought I had the head of a jackass. Methought I had been transformed into a jackass. No. Bottom's saying, methought I had, what does he say? Methought I was visited by a spirit from beyond the supernatural world, by a fairy queen. Methought I was in the company of the fairy queen, Titania, and all her little servant elves, all her little servant fairies. Because you know it's a monarchical world. She's the queen, she rules, and so they suffer. They spend their whole lives serving her particular needs, polishing her yacht, cleaning her mansions. That's what they do, serving her, cooking for her, cleaning for her. What a waste. Think about these very rich people in the world. All that productivity, all those people working for the rich, not contributing to the civilized world, making it a better world, but just indulging the rich, who are wasting their money on these things like yachts and, I don't know, $1,000, $10, $20, $30, $50, $100,000 birthday parties. How silly is that? How unethical is that? Wasting that money on a birthday party when it could be going to, going out there to preventing harm or curing it or trying your best to reduce it. And all those people who work for the rich spend their lives, butlers and maids and people who keep, they have, I don't know how many villas and mansions and country estates they have. The pool boy who has to clean the pool out every day for them. What a waste. What a waste of time and energy and a waste of potential, of human potential. Yeah. Those insanely rich people, they are a blight on society, aren't they? But at any rate, but that's what he's saying here. Methought I was in the past. Methought I was visited by, you hear that expression all the time. People, you can even find it in religious texts. So-and-so was visited by the spirit of, was visited by an angel, visited by Titania. He was, or in the company of a supernatural entity, Titania, the queen of the fairies. Methought I was, and then he stops himself. There is no man can tell what. No man can talk about the supernatural. So Bottom stops before he even finished. He won't even say those words to himself because no man can speak about the supernatural. How could you possibly know anything? So Bottom even realizes that here and he zips it shut. That's pretty tough for Bottom to do, isn't it? He likes to talk. Methought I was, and methought I had, and he pauses again. And here the critics I've come across, they want to say, methought I had the head of a donkey. No. That's not what Bottom was going to say. He's going to, what is he, you can fill in the blanks here now yourself. Methought I had, what, a relationship with Titania? Methought I had fairies serving me, meeting my every needs, bringing me jewels from the deep. Methought I had a fairy queen who, commanded me back to her bower where she, began to caress me and dote on me and served all my needs and gave me fairies to attend on me. But then he stops himself again, doesn't he? Methought I was, and methought I had, and he repeats. He stops, the dash mark. But man is but a patched fool, if he will offer to say what methought I had. Man is a patched fool. And this is in contrast to the court jester, the licensed fool of the king and the queen at court, who speaks truth to power. This is a patched fool, a jester, someone who's just there to entertain and make the king and queen laugh, not reveal the truth. to the king and queen, because kings and queens are enormous jackasses. They've got to be. Although, this idea of monarchy, if you've got a tyrant who's a benevolent tyrant, who's rational, who's scientific and philosophical, that can be a monarchy where a civilized world can be very limited and restricted and very behaved. Nobody's going to speed on that highway if the king says so, and the king is rational, and the king's reasoning capacities have led him to this conclusion, 1 + 1 = 2, you don't speed on the highway. So you could have a monarchy, and you could have a democracy of enormous jackasses, and now you've got a problem, because they're all voting, right, to continue with all these policies that are irrational. Or you can have a republic where a lot of jackasses vote in jackasses, big jackasses, into positions of power. So, these various types of political, these ways that we govern ourselves, it ultimately depends on, are we being rational? And if we are, then obviously the facts are going to point us. It's not that we have to discover them. They will be discovered for us, and we will behave. We will limit our behavior, our desires. We will see our desires can get in the way of reason. But again, this repetition, man is but a patched fool if he will offer to say, if he speaks on it. Shakespeare's saying once again, if you believe, fine. Just confess. You got to admit. Don't confess your addiction. Just go do it quietly. But you got to admit to yourself that you don't have any evidence. You don't have any truths derived from that evidence. And so you got to be quiet about it. You got to be real quiet about it. You can't tell anybody, not even your honey bunny, not even your little baby child. Nobody, particularly a baby child who can't reason, is going to listen to you and think you're the authority figure and you know all. So don't go around preaching it. And then here we have a direct reference to the Christian Bible. And as your footnote says here, it's a burlesque of Scripture on footnote 8. The eye hath not seen, and the ear hath not heard, neither have entered into the heart of man those things that God has prepared. From 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. And these are the words of Paul of Tarsus. And, I'm from the Bible Belt. I went to Bible school. So I know my Bible, baby. I got lots of little gold stars. Until the day when I think I was about 7, 8, or 9. I don't know how old I was. I don't remember. I might have been a little older. I don't think I could be that rational. I was pretty irrational for quite some time in my life, most of my life. But anyway, I remember this day we were told the story of Paul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus, and Paul was a persecutor of the Jews. And according to Paul, it's his story in a Bible, and it's an extraordinary claim he makes. But on the road to Damascus, the Christian God, he had a direct revelation. The Christian God appeared before him. Jesus appeared before him. And instantly Paul was converted. And from that time forward, he'd come into contact with the supernatural world. This was the true God, the Christian God. And Paul went on a mission. Paul went out. He became an apostle. He became, in other words, a preacher, a missionary. And he went out to spread the gospel, the good news, the one true God, the God Jesus, the Christian God does exist. Believe me, I saw it. Personal testimony, believe me. And I raised my hand. I remember saying, yeah, but that's just Paul's word. Why should we believe him? And of course, this is just another story in a book. Bottom's smart enough to realize, why should anybody believe me? If I tell them I, was visited by a fairy, that I was in contact with the supernatural world. That's just a story. That's just somebody's personal testimony. Just a book of stories, extraordinary claims. And Shakespeare is directly attacking. Look how he parodies those lines in the Bible. He says, Bottom says, "The eye of man hath not heard." That don't make sense. "The ear of man hath not seen." Okay, now I'm really confused. "Man's hand is not able to taste." Are you on drugs, Bob? "His tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was." It's just nonsense that comes out of his mouth, but ultimately, you can't talk about it. You can't report about this thing. It's a supernatural belief. And it's gibberish here at bottom. People will say, "What? Titania, a fairy? What are you talking about? What's a fairy? Where'd she come from? You speaking gibberish." When we start to understand why Bottom may not want to talk about the fairy, it's his ego, isn't it? This idea that once again he seems to have arrived at a really important philosophical truth. Remember the other philosophical truth? Reason and love keep very little company nowadays. If only some honest neighbor could introduce them. Remember that? And all because he was simply wanting to counter-argue with Titania. And here he realizes that if he goes about expounding on this visitation with the fairy queen, it was a dream. It was a dream. That's what he's thinking. It's a dream. Because, Bottom's ego, he's not going to win that argument, is he? But yeah, this is gibberish. This is nonsense. And if you look back at this, your writers, the editor writes a burlesque of Scripture. A burlesque of Scripture that Bottom. Well, yes, of course, it is a burlesque. It is a parody of these lines in the Scripture. But the Scripture, the words themselves are nonsense if you look at them. "The eye hath not seen, and the ear hath not heard, neither have entered into the heart of man those things that God has prepared." In other words, nobody's seen it. Nobody's heard it. Nobody can sincerely know about this supernatural being called Jesus. But here it is, Paul, pronounce it. Yeah, he does exist. But he says, "The eye hath not seen." What about his eye? He's saying he's seen it. "The ear hath not heard." He's heard it. He said, this idea, this revelation, Jesus coming before him, speaking to him, converting him to the Christian faith. Shakespeare is really, he's zeroing in now. And some critics say he has to do this indirectly and very carefully, but I think it's rather clear for any educated, rational person sitting in the audience. As we've said, most people in Shakespeare's day were Catholic and Protestant, but many of them were getting tired of these wars and all this torture and these horrors that were unfolding. And many people were saying, let's just all shut up about this. Many people wanted peace. Seeing these women being burned as witches, watching, Jews being persecuted. There were some rational people who were speaking out, and some people were hearing that and saying, maybe we ought to behave here and be quiet. And so Shakespeare, many critics speculate that this play was written for, people of the upper echelon, rich, powerful, the aristocracy during Shakespeare's day. And of course, they would have been educated. They would have come into contact with science and philosophy. And that suggests here, they're up to hearing these words. It's not going to get them all emotional and upset. "My mama told me." "What are you saying?" "What do you mean I have no proof?" "My mom and daddy told me." So look what Bottom says next. He says, "I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream." So he's going to turn it into a work of art. Isn't that what Shakespeare's doing? Let's make it a fiction, a work of art. to let everyone know that it really was just a dream. It wasn't real. It was a fiction. Because it hath no bottom. It's a fiction because it hath no bottom. The pun on bottom, of course. Bottom in a dream world is really no bottom, but more importantly, it has no bottom, this belief. There's no evidence, no proof, scientific evidence or philosophical truths that scientific evidence can lead to. No foundation, in other words. But it also has no bottom in the sense that it can't possibly have a bottom because no one can know anything about it. It has no bottom because, yes, again in your footnote it says, because the supernatural world, again, if it were to exist, would be unfathomable. No one could speak about it. No one could talk about it. No one could pronounce anything on the supernatural world, preach about it. And that's what Shakespeare's concerned about. Not whether it exists or not. That's beside the point. But it's these people who hold these very strong convictions that it does exist, and they begin to impose, right? They begin to sacrifice other people on the altar of their gods. And Shakespeare's seeing this happening in his day and age, in his own country and across Europe. It hath no bottom. And I will sing it to the latter end of a play. There's his ego again. He's wanting to have Peter Quince write a ballad about Bottom's dream, and Bottom himself will sing it at the end of the play. And again, it's to be sung in a play, a fiction, before the Duke himself. Again, you see Bottom's ego. This guy. He's found a way, hasn't he, to speak of this. He'll to speak about it, but it will be a fiction called Bottom's Dream because it hath no bottom, no proof, and no ability to comprehend or to understand if indeed this realm were to exist, a supernatural world. And then he says, peradventure, to make it the more gracious, I shall sing it at her death. And of course he's referring to, in the play, Pyramus and Thisbe. Thisbe will die at the end of that play. She will take her own life, and we'll turn to that in a moment. But this idea of to sing it at her death, and doing so is a gracious act, and we're reminded one reason why many people do hold belief in the supernatural, and that is that people die, and people are mortal, and most romantics, and as a realist, that idea frightens me as well. I mean, not death. I know when I'm dead, I'll be unconscious, so I won't even know I ever existed or I ever existed as me. No. I mean, I won't exist. How could I possibly know? Not only did I never exist, but I never existed as me. So, yeah, I never had a honey buddy. I never had a wife. I never had, a mama or a daddy or a sister, a baby sister. I love my baby sister, but, I'll never know I even had one because I won't exist anymore. I'll never know I had friends. Well, I don't have too many friends anymore. But anyway, this idea of death and how painful that is, and of course we memorialize, we have funeral services, and of course, the Christian memorial service, the idea, the promise of the eternal life. People are grieving, people are deeply, deeply distressed, and they've lost someone they become attached to and addicted to. They call it love, but I would argue that it's that addiction again. It's that need to feed, to feel, to escape pain and harm, to feel protected and comfortable and secure. People close to you, hopefully, the people who care about you, they boost your ego a little, hopefully, but all too often instead they just, rather than boosting your ego, some of them, many of them, will try to poke holes in your balloon, your little balloon of hot air. But yeah, more gracious, the idea, let's give someone a dignified exit here. Death psychologically can be frightening for people, the idea that you won't exist anymore. The dying process is what frightens me. That's the really scary part. I mean, to get from here, to get from life to death, and I don't know how it's going to happen, and it's already decided according to this deterministic view of the universe, but which we'll talk more about in Hamlet. But getting there, I mean, the aging process is painful enough. I never thought I would ever age. When I was young, I thought I'd be a Greek god forever, but no, that ain't true. Yeah, I never thought I'd hit 30. But the aging process is painful enough, but the dying process, that don't look pretty. But this idea of memorializing someone, remembering them, holding them in our memory, and that way keeping them alive a little bit longer in our memories. And this fear of death that many people have, and many people turn to this supernatural belief because they've been raised to, and it's comforting. And so this idea of Bottom having come into contact with the supernatural world that will be written in a ballad and be played at Thisbe's death at the end of the play, that Bottom and his working men are going to, hopefully, they hope to put it on before the Duke. That yes, it will, the story of the two young lovers, Pyramus and Thisbe, is a tragic one, but there will be consolation in the end because they will ultimately be reunited in a magical kingdom above, together, along with all their loved ones, I would imagine. Because that fear, that losing the loved ones, nobody wants to think about that. Not Dorothy, nobody. And so this idea of let's, give Thisbe a dignified exit here, memorialize her, and at the same time console ourselves that yes, she mattered, she was of significance, and now she is no longer suffering the tragic loss of her lover and the painful experience of her death, and now they are reunited in the whatever paradise she and Pyramus perhaps believed in. So that's what's going on here in Bottom's dream. And we're reminded of that here. Shakespeare's a very important passage in the play, I would argue, because as I said, this belief in the supernatural really is the bedrock belief in this romantic view of the world. Yeah, I was thinking too, and again, I don't know if I've ever come across this idea, but, and not, that notion feeds my ego, but then I remember, well, you don't have these thoughts freely. You're not creating these thoughts. No artist is free of cause and effect. No artist is free. No artist has this freedom to choose these thoughts. These thoughts that pop up, these words that I'm speaking that come up into consciousness, I'm not freely choosing these words. They're just popping out of my mouth. And if I stop and deliberate, the word appears, the brain makes the word and then it pops out. Because if I'm stopping to deliberate, you could see I'm not really choosing the word still, even if I stop to deliberate, because the words are, let's break a sentence apart. A sentence is made of phrases, and phrases are made of words, and words are made of the alphabet. I can't have a thought unless I know the alphabet. I can't have a thought in English unless I first know the alphabet, and the alphabet's been programmed in my brain. So when I speak a sentence, what has my brain done? I'll tell you what it's done. It's taken that English alphabet and, it's arranged it in these words, which I've learned, part of my experience. And then these words are arranging in sentences because I've studied English, I've studied syntax. That's what my subconscious is doing. That's what my brain is doing. And these phrases, these words, these letters and these words and these phrases are forming sentences. And if I speak at great length, they're forming paragraphs and even an essay and even, oh, I don't know, I'm speaking, this could be a Moby Dick of a fiction here. If you've read Moby Dick, it's that full and it's filled mostly with whale blubber. I'm sorry to say. Bunch of blubber. But at any rate, Melville being a romantic. But at any rate, somebody's going to challenge me on that. Maybe my sister will challenge me on that. We like to argue about, literary works of art. We're both, we've got this idea. We're up there trying to find this philosophical truth, baby. My sister's one of the few people I can argue with. Her and my mama. My mama will listen to me too. It's nice to have a mama who'll listen to you. But mamas have to listen to you, don't they? At least my mama does. She's a good mama. She listens to me. All right. But at any rate, yeah, I'd like to think it's my ego coming across this idea. But of course, all of my experiences may have come together. And one, I associate one thing with another. I've never associated this book with this before, this mouse. But now suddenly I see a sled sliding. Suddenly I see the mouse as a sled. And now I've got a new association. I probably have that somewhere in my brain now. And I just saw it, picked it up, put it together, and it looked like what I've had in the past. I know what a sled is, and I know what ice is. Here's a sled on ice. But anyway, these sentences coming out, look at me moving around. My brain's doing all this. I'm not aware of it until I become aware of it, but then my brain's still doing it. It's my brain. It's happening down here, and there's electrical impulses. I don't know how I'm moving my arm like this. I'm not freely doing that. How am I freely doing that? I don't even know that much about muscles and how anything inside I've never studied anatomy or how all this stuff comes together and works. I have very little understanding of anatomy, so I don't know what's going on here. Why, always rubbing my beard. Got that beard that I need to scratch, the itch, I'm always touching my nose like Samantha on Big Witch. I don't know why I do that all the time. It's weird. Look at me. I don't know what I'm doing here. Yeah, that's the truth. But, these letters of the alphabet. I mean, I can't freely think in ancient Greek. I can do a little thinking in French because I've studied the French language, but I can't start thinking in ancient Greek and have free thoughts, freely decide what to think in Greek. So it's pretty obvious that the brain, all these experiences of the past, they are now part of my program. And the mistakes I make when I'm speaking, sometimes I catch them and correct them because I am rather self-conscious in front of the camera. But, all the mistakes I made, these are the little glitches, the little errors in my code, in my programming. If my antecedent doesn't agree with my pronoun, error. Sometimes I catch it, sometimes I don't, because of how I've been programmed. And if you don't know what an antecedent is, and that antecedents need to agree with their programs, well, then your brain won't be aware that your antecedent doesn't agree with your pronoun. So, yeah. So anyway, this idea, I was thinking of another idea that Shakespeare is toying with here, and I'm going to just speculate here. I mean, I just thought of it last night, or I didn't think of it, my brain thought about it, and came up with it. I don't know how it did it. But, so I'm just speculating. But it's something to explore, and when I have more time, I might explore it. But not only is this a parody, I would say, of this particular passage in the Bible, this particular scripture in the Bible, but it may also be a parody of the virgin birth in the Christian Bible. And I was thinking, I made some notes here, and I'm going to refer to my notes because this is still not plugged in. I just recently downloaded it, so. But I was thinking Bottom's dream, as we've seen, can correspond to Paul's revelation. And we've mentioned this before, Bottom, the jackass, Paul becoming the apostle. Bottom, the rational man, but Paul goes out and preaches. And I mentioned all this other information. But this other idea, the parody of the virgin birth. So first of all, Bottom, he has the head of a jackass. I was thinking, why? I've always come to these other observations why I think Shakespeare has Bottom's head changed into that of Jackass. And I've mentioned this before. But then I also remember I went to Bible school. And I was quite the competitor. And I remember that the Virgin Mary rode into Bethlehem on a male donkey. And then that triggered another memory, and that was that, and you know, a male donkey and a female horse, a mare. Remember, Shakespeare uses that word mare at the end of Act 3. So a female horse, a mare, and a male donkey, when they come together, they produce a mule, or otherwise known as a male jackass or a jack. By the way, Jack and Jill. I don't know, maybe Shakespeare, he had hit the word jack, then he thought of the word mare, then he thought of the word jackass, and then suddenly he's off and running, and, he comes up with this idea of a parody. Interesting, isn't it? Maybe that's how his brain was operating, because I'm sure he knew his Bible. Yeah, I know he knew his Bible. I mean, he's always, particularly in the anti-Christian plays, many people see them as Christian plays, but I always see them as anti-Christian. Many of the anti-Christian plays, all these allusions to the Christian Bible. But then I recall that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a male donkey. And then I recall that male donkeys are work animals. They're bred by humans. Horses and donkeys create the jackass. And so I remember that the jackass, the mule, was particularly horses and donkeys were crossbred. I had to look some of this up. They were crossbred to produce the mule, which is a work animal. In humans, you see what they will do to exploit animals. The poor mule, humans exploit the mule. Most humans think that their brains matter more than the mule's brain. But yeah, I imagine it's not fun for someone to be on your back and you had to cart that person. But the Virgin Mary and Jesus both rode in. Jesus rode into Jerusalem, and the Virgin Mary rode into Bethlehem, both of them on a male donkey. And male donkeys and mares produce jackasses. They've been purposely bred, crossbred, so that we have this male jackass, or a jack, or a mule. A jackass or a mule, a jack, in other words, and a working animal. And Bottom is a working man, isn't he? He's out there producing for society, isn't he? And then I remember Titania is a spirit, and she, and the suggestion that, at least in her head, I think it's in her head, but there's a suggestion here, the idea of the spirit in the head engaging in sex with Bottom. Bottom's in her head too. So you have Bottom, and remember I was always saying Bottom strikes me as a virgin. So here you have an inversion, the spirit is female, where with the Virgin Mary you have the God who is male and who shapeshifts in the form of the Holy Ghost and impregnates through Mary's ear, whispers in her brain. Right? This is how the Virgin Mary can conceive, and still it's an immaculate conception. It's the idea of the truth. The Word is what's being conceived here. And of course, in Titania's mind, that's where the sex is occurring with Bottom in the brain. And he, like an airy spirit, shall go. That's what's happening in her imagination. And those famous words at the end of that scene between Bottom and Titania. And the Virgin Mary, in her union with the Holy Ghost, gives birth to Jesus, who is a God incarnate, the suggestion of a half male, half mortal, half God, half man, half God. And of course, in ancient Greece, and in this play several times, Heracles, the Greek god who becomes the Roman god Hercules, he is born of Zeus, the male god, the supernatural figure, and Alchemy, who is the mortal female. And alchemy, we have the precursor to chemistry. The ancients practiced what was known as alchemy. They were attempting to be scientists, and they were, in their own interest, most of them, they were trying to change a base metal into gold. And alchemy and Zeus come together and produce Hercules, the base mortal who becomes part immortal. And so you have the Virgin Mary, and you have the Christian God shape-shifting into the form of the Holy Ghost, and together they produce this something that is gold, because it's a God incarnate who can come before man and reveal himself of the truth of the Christian faith. So now that base metal has been formed into gold because the word that's revealed to Paul, and Paul, he goes up among the world and preaches to the heathens, to the Romans, the truth. And so we have this idea of the true, of the supernatural, a supernatural explanation in the form of the Christian God, Jesus. But what is Bottom's truth? Bottom, of course, too, he's half beast, half man. And he comes together with Titania, and what does he give birth to? He gives birth to Bottom's dream. Bottom's dream. That's what is gold for Shakespeare, because what is, in essence, Bottom's dream? In essence, for Shakespeare, what is the real gold is not this idea of here is proof positive that the Christian God exists, that this supernatural world does exist, and the one true God is the Christian God, and the base metal has been turned into gold. We have this idea now we can have a God among us who can show us the truth. Jesus being half man, half God, like Heracles and Hercules. It's alchemy. But we have Bottom, who is half jackass, and he's half enormous ego, and then he's half reason. The man, right? For Shakespeare, what makes a man is being able to reason. Touching now the point of human skill is reason. And here Bottom's reasoning, and he gives birth to gold, to this idea not that the supernatural world exists, but that even if it did, nobody could know anything about it, so you might as well just shut up about it. Don't speak. Don't be like a Jesus or a Paul and go out and preach. These characters in this fictional world, they've got the wrong idea. But here in this fictional world, Shakespeare's fictional world, these stories, these extraordinary claims that Bottom would be making about a supernatural world, Bottom comes to the conclusion, zip it. Don't speak about the supernatural. Because even if it did exist, you can't know anything about it. Nobody can. Shakespeare's saying if anybody ever comes to you and says, let me tell you something about the supernatural world, well, you ought to run the other way, because you're looking at a jackass. And I don't know. What do you think about that argument? That's interesting. And as I said, I might have to work out the details here, but I think that's something to get started with. So at any rate, I wish I could take credit, but I'm a determinist, and I don't have the freedom to choose these thoughts. They just, because of my experiences, they just, I've been programmed. They're down there somewhere in my subconscious, and whatever's happening around me, this pops out, that pops out, and sometimes this and that get connected. And now I've got something new in my programming down there. But at any rate, so in Act 4, so let's turn away from Bottom's Dream now. In Act 4, I've spent some time on it. It's important. It looks like I'm going to go over 3 hours today. I have to make a part 3, but I don't, it's the last lecture. I'm game if you are. So let's turn to Act 4, Scene 2, and let's take a break a moment. I know I need one. I'll be back. And I am back. Let's turn to Act 4, Scene 2. Quince and the other working men wondering what's happened to Bottom, I just want to mention briefly, just touch on this scene for about 5 minutes. If you notice at line 3, what Starveling says, they want to know, have you been to Bottom's house? Has he come home yet? And Starveling replies, he cannot be heard of. Out of doubt, he is transported. Out of doubt, beyond a rational doubt, no doubt, he's been transported. In other words, the fairies have kidnapped him. And here again, this is fascinating. A lot of people say, well, yes, they've seen Puck shapeshift in the woods. Here's proof that the fairies are real. And others have seen the fairies. But no, remember, think of Puck symbolically. And when, yes, we're watching Puck on the stage. He is the shapeshifter. All these creatures he transforms himself into and frightens the working men so that they all flee. And of course, Puck changes Bottom's head. The working men see Bottom's head changing that of an ass. That's where it makes them run. And then Puck races after them, chases after them, and frightens them even more. So all the working men flee. So yes, we see that. It's on the stage. We see Puck. I haven't argued. I haven't denied that. But what I've been saying is that we've got to think about Puck symbolically. And we talked about that. But in this scene in particular where he, frightens the other working men, this is the idea again, symbolically suggestive of this belief in the supernatural, that when a mystery is put before you, particularly in the dark, in some remote place where it's frightening enough to begin with, that the romantic, some sort of noise, some sort of movement is going to make that leap and make to a supernatural explanation. And this idea of out of doubt. The romantic is going to believe. You've met people who said, I swear, I saw a ghost. I saw a ghost. I went down into the basement. It was dark down there, and there was a storm blowing outside, lots of noise everywhere. And I was petrified when I went down there, and then I saw it. So, yeah, your friend is a romantic. Your friend already believed in ghosts before he went creeping down those stairs. And that's just personal testimony too, remember. That's not going to stand up in a court of law. If your friend says, I saw the invisible man. He killed Nicole Simpson, the invisible man. No. Don't listen. Run. Don't listen to anybody who tells you anything about a supernatural world. And then, of course, Bottom enters, and this is the great passage here. Let's turn here at the bottom of the page. Again, I'm on page 1383, Act 4, Scene 2, and this is line 27 toward the bottom of the page, and everyone's just, oh, hooray, Bottom's here, it's a nice, the idea that these guys, they have grown addicted to one another. They are working men, You will be closer in life to the people you work with, or at least you'll know them. You'll spend more time with the people you work with if you're part of the working class than you will with your honey bunny or your family. You spend most of your life with those people in the workplace, so you got to get along. But a lot of people form, addictions. They form attachments to people they work with. They become friends outside of the workplace. And so this group, this little band of working men, have grown very close, addicted to one another. That's what friendship is. It's this addiction, this need. It feeds your ego, makes you feel safe. Remember? But at any rate, everyone's rejoiced to see Bottom. And look what Bottom says here. Masters, I am to discourse wonders. What? Wonders? Miracles? Something wondrous? Something wondrous to behold? It sounds as if Bottom is really, he's about to let that proverbial cat right out of the bag. He's about to let that fairy right out of the bag here, isn't he? He's going to tell him about Titania, about his having been visited by a supernatural being. And we know Bottom's ego. We could see his brain wrestling. We can say that enormous jackass brain of his just a wrestler. Two sumo wrestlers in there, perhaps. Enormous ego. And now this wonderful philosophical truth he's come up with. Those pretty big wrestlers. Ego versus philosophical truth. It's going to be quite a contest in his head, isn't it? Masters, I am to discourse wonders, but ask me not what. Don't ask me what it is. And here you see Bottom, on the one hand, he's going to tell him something, on the other hand, but don't ask me what it is. So, Bottom, again, it's the way to make himself center stage. He gets to be the star. When he returns here, already he's center stage. He's in the spotlight. And here, I've got a secret. I know something you don't know. And you can see that happening with Bottom here in this scene here. But ask me not what. And then he says something interesting. For if I tell you, I am not true Athenian. He's not a true Athenian. Am I saying that right? Athenian? He is not a true Athenian, if he reveals to his friends, his working fellows, that he has been visited. He was visited by a supernatural being. That he was in the company of Titania, the Queen of the Fairies. He will not be a true Athenian. And of course, then we recall another important reason why Shakespeare set this play in Athens. Athens, of course, is the birthplace of reason. It is the birthplace of science. Science, remember, in ancient Greek means knowledge. And Athens is the birthplace of philosophy. And remember, in ancient Greek, philosophy means love of wisdom. Science comes first. You get the knowledge, you acquire the knowledge. Wisdom can't be far behind. All you got to do is add those numbers up, and you've got a philosophical truth. So you can see science is born, followed very quickly by philosophy. Knowledge leads to wisdom. And knowledge and wisdom, science and philosophy, are the tools in the toolbox of reason. Reason is the only tool. It's the toolbox itself, as I've said, toward finding that you have to have. You've got to have the toolbox of reason. And inside that toolbox, you've got the wrench. You could say that's science. And then you've got the screwdriver, which is philosophy. And, you can start screwing in the truths. That's right. You can build upon these truths. You can create, with your tools, a whole civilization. Wow. And so Bottom is saying, if I speak about a supernatural being, a supernatural world, then I am no true Athenian. I am not a man of reason. And we're going to see this idea again in Hamlet. Hamlet is not a man of reason. Hamlet doesn't know what kind of man to become. And the biggest question in the play for Hamlet is, what makes a man? And Hamlet will never find the answer to that question. And Shakespeare is at pains in that play and in this play to tell us that what makes you unique. There's only one thing that makes you unique and special, and that separates you from the other species. Not that you can feel pain, the other species can feel pain. And it's not that you win the Super Bowl. Other species can run faster than you. It's not that you can run the 50-yard dash faster than anybody in the world, because you can't beat a lot of animals out there. That's not what sets you apart. That's not what makes you unique. That's not your cheap tool, them legs of yours. It's your brain. Them billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of neurons, hundreds of trillions of synapses. This ability to think, to be rational. That's what creates a civilized community. That's why animals in the wild, they form communities. They can do a little bit of reasoning, some of them, but for the most part, it's programmed. It's how the species has survived. We're programmed as well. We see that. We come together, but through our ability to reason, we can come together and create a civilized world. I think it was Aristotle somebody who said that man is political. And the idea of a polis, a city-state, that's what we are. And how do we create a city-state, a city, a civilization? Through reason. And you're familiar with Aristotle, one of the first philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers. But Bottom says, if I tell you I am no true Athenian. And then he says, look what he says next. I will tell you everything, right as it fell out. So now he's saying, oh, okay, I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you. And everybody says, so you see Bottom going back and forth. He wants to tell them. His desire is so great. That ego of his. I was with the fairy queen. But, but he'll be no truer thing. And he's come to this philosophical realization. Because, and again I argue, not because he's speaking suddenly like out of the mouth of babes come words of wisdom, that sort of idea. No, Bottom comes once again to this philosophical truth because he realized he doesn't want his ego to be damaged. So, sort of having an argument with himself instead of with Titania now, making a counter argument with himself. That's how he discovers that truth. And everybody says, let us hear, sweet Bottom, let us hear. And then he says, not a word of me. You can see, no, not a word of me. He's really enjoying being, center stage here. All the spotlights are on him, the footlights, the spotlights, the baby lights in the back, lighting them up so sweet. Sweet Bottom. He's got quite an audience before him here. And it makes us wonder just, will Bottom be able to hold out here? Will he ever be able to hold out? But at any rate, he starts giving them orders, what to do, go here, go there, do this, do that. And finally he says, away, go away. Everyone away, go do what I've told you to. So Bottom once again, Shakespeare always showing us that Bottom is this ego. But yeah, I can imagine Bottom, maybe down the road as he gets older, and many old people, nobody pays them much attention anymore. So maybe someday you could see him sitting in a bar, lonely, all his friends, he's lost them all, they're all dead. There he is sitting in a bar, he's turned drunk, an alcoholic. You can see him at the bar now, drinking. And we're going to make a jackass of himself, isn't he? Because he's going to drink. That personal identity is going to change. He's going to turn somebody sitting on the bar stool. Maybe some young female who reminds him of Titania. He's going to say, did I tell you about the time that I slept with the fairy queen? Let's take a pause. I'll be right back. And we're back. Let's turn to Act 5, Scene 1. And I am on page 1384 in your anthologies. We'll begin at the top of the scene, Act 5, Scene 1. We'll begin with line 1, and Hippolyta speaks. And then we have Theseus' famous monologue. Again, many critics write about this speech. But Hippolyta here, obviously she and Theseus have had they're in the midst of a conversation off stage, and they walk onto the stage. The conversation's still going, and Hippolyta says, "'Tis strange, my Theseus, that these three lovers speak of." And of course, what does she mean? Well, the lovers. "'Tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of." I misspoke there. That these lovers speak of. She's referring to Demetrius and Helena, Lysander and Hermia. And evidently, the young couples, in thinking about the night before, their little escapade there in the woods, the young couples have chalked it up to the supernatural, to fairies. Remember, many people, even in Shakespeare's day, they still believed in fairies, and fairies were malevolent creatures, evil, frightening, something to be feared. Don't walk inside a fairy ring, you'll be trapped and under the evil fairy's power. But these lovers, they have chalked this off to their misbehavior in the night in the forest, to the supernatural. They simply can't understand otherwise, so they posit this supernatural explanation. And here we see yet another reason why, the devil made me do it. It was the devil. And here again, we've seen that before, and here again we see it. The lovers don't wish to confront their former behavior when they turn predatory beasts and begin attacking one another and attempting to kill each other, and the name calling. I mean, how painful to recall these memories. And they simply want to dismiss all that. They want to try to rationalize their way around that enormous trunk of truth. They don't want to run into that trunk. That's too painful. So they're trying to get around the trunk of truth, just like a lot of people try to get around the evolutionary truth. They want to get around that trunk of truth. And so they have spoken to Hippolyta, and they told her it's fairies. Look how we behaved. Look what we said. The kinds of things. Oh, Bahar! It must have been beyond a rational doubt. It must have been evil fairies. And of course, we know in part it was. But again, remember, we're thinking symbolically here. The fairies don't really exist. Shakespeare is not saying that. So anyway, then we have, of course, Theseus's important monologue here, his speech to her, and look, he just takes command. Look at this long speech. Again, it fills all the page up. He's going to assert his authority, and he's going to appear as the man of reason here. But when detect the ironies throughout here, we know Theseus is not a man of reason, even though he's the head of Athens, the state authority figure. This is a man of desire. This is a man who desires sex. This is a man who desires to be on top on the battlefield and in the bedroom. This is a man whose ego must be puffed, puffed, puffed. I mean, it must be as big as one of the air balloons. That's how big his ego is. And so he is not a man of reason, I would argue, although many people say, well, this doesn't quite sound like Theseus. They say that here Shakespeare has lost control of his artistic abilities, and here Shakespeare is speaking Shakespeare, of course, is speaking through all the characters, but here Shakespeare missteps, and it sounds too much like Shakespeare rather than like Theseus. But I would say no. Maybe in other places in Shakespeare's work, I don't know. I haven't read all his works, but here, this is the man of desire, remember, he's having this conversation with Hippolyta, and he's wanting to assert his authority over her. And now the opportunity arises for him to dismiss this idea of fairies. Remember, Theseus, there's nothing in this play to suggest he doesn't believe in gods. And he tells Hermia in Act 1, Scene 1, that her father should be as a god. I mean, you could make the argument that he's just speaking, metaphorically, that simile, but this belief in the supernatural, even if you say, well, he doesn't believe in the supernatural, no, he doesn't believe in any supernatural entities, no Greek gods or fairies or whatever, but still we've seen that he is a man of desire. I think I've made that case clear. He has been raised in this particular culture, this patriarchal world, and he has bought into this notion that men are superior and men's brains in pain are more important than women's brains in pain. We've seen him, how his behavior toward women, the lady killer. So anyway, I don't need to go I don't need to go back and collect all those breadcrumbs. But at any rate, he says to her, so I think he's arguing with her much the way the bottom argues, that he's simply taking a position because he wants to assert his dominance. Here, we dominate people, brings us particular power if we dominate them. Well, for some people, if they dominate people physically, it brings them it really feeds their ego. And of course, other people, if they dominate someone intellectually, that, can't feed their ego. Some people make the argument because they want to win, because that will feed their ego. Whereas I would say, no, it's not who wins, remember, it's finding that truth. So Thesis says, more strange than true. It's not true. It's more strange than true. I never may believe these antique fables. Notice antique fables. Antique, the ancients. Interesting, he's in an ancient world, but he sees himself as modern, of course, in his time period he is. He's looking back at the ancestors and all these stories the primitives spoke of. Shakespeare's reminding the audience that belief in the supernatural is a primitive idea. The ancients believed in the supernatural because the ancients weren't living in an ever-increasing scientific world where they were explaining away the supernatural. They were providing natural explanations, and the supernatural was slowly but surely, it was being dropped 6 feet down under, and the dirt was being thrown on the coffin. So Shakespeare's reminding that these fables, these stories, that's all they are. They're stories that have been handed down from generation to generation, and you trace them back to the ancients, to primitive people. Primitive people just didn't know no better. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have telescopes. They didn't understand germ theory. They believed in devil possession. So he says, I never believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. By the way, antique fable, remember, Theseus himself is an antique fable. He's a legend. He's a ancient Greek story. Theseus didn't exist, but many ancient Greeks believe he did. Shakespeare's reminding us Theseus is a fable, an antique fable. He's a fiction. There's another irony. So the irony, watch for the ironies throughout here. He says, I never may believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. Notice the toys again. Notice the metaphor. Belief in fairies is belief for children. They're toys. Clap your hands if you believe Tinkerbell. Don't let her die. Clap your hands if you believe. I have faith in you, Tinkerbell. Remember, it's a toy. It's a game that children play. You got it sometime to put away those toys. It's important. You got to stop believing in Tinkerbell. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains. Seething brains. There is that image. Shakespeare knows, right? He's on the cusp of the scientific, between the medieval period and the modern scientific period. And he's on the cusp. People are discovering. Shakespeare knows it has to do with the brain. The physical thing, the brain. He doesn't know, we still don't know all that goes on in the brain. We're still studying and trying to figure out. But we know what's most important about the brain. We know the most important truths. We may not know all the details. We know what a car is, what a car's function is. We may not know how many atoms make up the paint on the car. We don't know all the details of the car. But we know what's important to know about a car. And we know what's important to know about a brain. That is a physical thing. It's a tool, an evolutionary tool for detecting pain and running from that pain. That's what it is. That's all it is. Detecting problems, running from problems. Nothing mysterious going on there. These seething brains, and these seething brains, of course, the hormones. Something to do, some juice in the brain. Shakespeare's wise enough to know that something's going on in the brain. Something physical. Such shaping fantasies. And it shapes, there's that idea of shapeshifter again. Now the brains, these seething brains, they begin to shape, to create fantasies. What is natural, there's a natural explanation, suddenly shapeshifts into a supernatural explanation. Because someone doesn't know the natural explanation, right? So it becomes a supernatural explanation. Brains are doing this shape-shifting thing. Such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. You say you know something that, yeah, these brains, they say they know about fairies. They know something that the scientific world knows nothing about. No philosophical truths that fairy exist have ever been derived from any scientific knowledge base. So, here are the facts. Here are the fantasies. That cool reason, that apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Then look at this passage. So, by the way, it's interesting, did you note that lovers are compared with madmen. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains. There it is, madmen, irrational men. Madmen can do a lot of damage, can't they? But then we have here the lunatic, the lover, and the poet. He brings in the poet here. Isn't this interesting? The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. So this idea, they're all composed. They're all of imagination, all composed of imagination. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet. Well, we've seen the demonstration about the lover. Look what he says. Well, he first mentions the lunatic. So look what the lunatic here. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. Notice the lunatic is being associated with these supernatural realms and entities that many religious people subscribe to, devils and hells. The lunatic, or what does he say here? One, the lunatic, sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman. Can Shakespeare be any clearer here? The lover, all is frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The reference here to Helen of Troy. Maybe one reason why Shakespeare calls Helena, to remind us of Helen of Troy, because that's what Lysander and Demetrius see when they wake up. Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, supposedly in Greek legend, who launched the face that launched 1,000 ships. The Trojan War was ultimately essentially over Helen of Troy. We'll talk more about Helen of Troy. You can Wikipedia that. But you get the idea here that the lover sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt, in a gypsy. And of course, gypsies in Shakespeare's days were, they were, Shakespeare, most people in Shakespeare's day were very prejudiced against anyone who wasn't part of their tribe, just like today. And of course, gypsies, dark skin, dark complexion, and your culture, you're raised in a culture, and most people, what you're familiar with is what you're going to be attracted to. So most people in Shakespeare's day, most ancient Greeks, I don't know what color skin the ancient Greeks had, but anyway, most people hang out with people of their own skin only because, it's just feels more comfortable for them. It's what they're used to. It's such a shame. I really think it's just, so many great ideas could be exchanged between these different races, but we do tend to segregate into groups, and it's one of the tragedies, this idea of the love of one's own, one's own race. And but anyway, so Helen's beauty representing the, what the lover sees, when in reality it's the brow of an Egyptian, a gypsy woman. And then he turns to the poet. The poet's eye, and the eye representing, this idea of reason. I've seen clearly the poet is someone who climbs to the mountain, pronounces the truth, these philosophical truths. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling, and you can see the imagination at work. In a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So here we have the image of the poet who, he too is composed of imagination. he too looks from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and in fine frenzy rolling, his pen becomes a kind of magical wand, if you will. And that magical wand, the poet's pen, he turns the forms of things unknown. Notice that's the forms of things unknown, which would have to be the forms of things that no one knows of. They are unknown. Again, this idea of the supernatural. And turns the forms of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes. Gives them shape, the forms of these invisible, non-physical entities. Gives them shapes. And gives to airy nothing. They are nothing. They are an airy nothing. Out of nothing. His pen, like a magical wand, poof. And out of this airy nothing, he turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Gives them a name and a local habitation. The poet's pen, out of nothing, gives this nothing a shape and calls it Titania, and calls it Oberon, and calls it Puck, and then gives them a local habitation. He puts them in the woods just outside of Athens. But they are airy nothings. They don't exist. He gives to these things unknown, can't be known. How can we know them? The only way we can know them is in a fiction here, but it's a fiction. And it's the poet's pen that's doing the magic here. His imagination, if you will. His brain. His brain. It's his eye, his brain. The poet, remember I made the argument, the poet is the scientist, and the poet is the philosopher. And the poet observes with his eye, and then he goes and he creates with his magical pen, his wand. And here in this case, he creates the supernatural. So why does Shakespeare create the supernatural? Because he's observed that most people have this belief in the supernatural. And he's observed the irrational thinking is leading to all these kinds of harms. And so here, through Theseus's mouth, Theseus is Shakespeare's mouthpiece, if you will. But remember, I'm arguing that Theseus is making this argument because he's challenging Hippolyta. He wants to defeat her in this argument. But the poet's pen gives to nothing. This doesn't exist. It's an airy nothing. But the poet's pen gives them shape, gives them a name, gives them a local habitation. That's what it's doing. But I also see here, again, Shakespeare, because you can, once more, this is the problem of knowing the other mind. In this case, what's he saying here? But I think there's room to interpret this another way, and that is that there are some poets out there who are bad poets. Shakespeare's told us this before. Remember that parody of the sonnet when Demetrius wakes up. Oh, Helen, goddess nymph, perfect divine, to what, my dear, shall I compare thy night? No. There are some really bad poets in the world. And now this idea of in a fine frenzy rolling, it's the idea that they are, in a sense, their imagination has run wild. And their imagination is not really based here in reality. It's suddenly seeing something that doesn't exist. And now the poet's pen and the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, turns them to shapes, these forms of things unknowns, and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Some poets, some artists, many of them considered to be great artists, are romantics, hold these romantic beliefs in the supernatural. I think of many transcendentalists, many romantic poets, many romantic fiction writers, and there are many religious writers also. And when they write about the supernatural, they're writing about it as if they actually, this airy nothing, this thing unknown, they've given it a local habitation and a name. That they've actually, sort of, in a way, their work has become a kind of God incarnate, if you will. Proof, their revelation, Here is their personal testimony of this supernatural world. For Shakespeare, that's a dangerous artist, not just a bad artist, but a dangerous artist. Because art, entertainment, it's a very, very powerful industry. And a lot of people want to be entertained. And a lot of people believe what they read, believe what they see, believe what artists tell them. There again, you have the authority figures. So this passage works, you could interpret this particular passage about the poet, I would argue, in two ways. The first is the true artist, the one who's revealing this is an airy nothing. And the only reason that the artist is doing this is because he's using the poet's eye. He's using cool reason, and he's doing it for a specific purpose, to point out in Shakespeare's case that these particular faith-based beliefs are irrational and unethical, ultimately lead to unethical actions. But then, on the other hand, you have this other sort of artist who is the romantic and who does believe in a fine frenzy rolling, his eye in a fine frenzy rolling. He does believe in the supernatural realm, and he speaks of this realm. He's yet one more voice, one more jackass who's speaking about something nobody can possibly know about. Even if it did exist, nobody could possibly know about it. Super means above and beyond. Supernatural, above and beyond the natural world, means above and beyond human comprehension, because you and me, we's natural, we's physical, we're stuck right here in the natural world. So it's an interesting moment. Such tricks hath strong imagination. Notice again, it's tricks. Such tricks hath strong imagination, that it would be but apprehend some joy. Such tricks hath strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. Cause and effect. I won the lottery. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Puck. Thank you. Good fellow. Good Robin. Sweet Puck. It must have been the gods. I'm blessed. The hurricane moves through the trailer park, and all the houses, all the trailers are destroyed except your trailer, my trailer. There we are. Our trailer's saved. It's like, I'm blessed. Everybody else around you's dead, but I'm blessed. So, yeah. And then finally, or in the night, imagining some fear. How easy is a bush supposed to bear? So again, that's what's happened to the working men in the night, and to a lesser degree, of course, the lovers. The idea that people imagine it's a bush when it's really a bear. Well, now, that doesn't quite work, does it? That's not. If you're in the middle of the night and you're thinking, your brain sees something and think, is that a bush or a bear? Well, I would err on the side of reason. I'd say, that's a bear. I'd get out of there. But you get the idea here. The bush and the bear, it's not really a bear, it's a bush. It ain't really Puck. Right? It's your imagination. You've seen a bush, and you think you're seeing, the plant in Little Shop of Horrors. You're seeing a monstrous plant. So at any rate, once again, we have this idea, this challenge, reason versus faith, desire versus, again, reason versus faith, reason versus desire. It's always reason. Be in the camp of reason. And that's what Theseus is saying here. Of course, Hippolyta doesn't buy it. She's still, look at her. Now remember, she too has this ego. And she's going to say, yes, but they all saw it. And all their stories coincide. Well, yeah, of course they all do. If you're raised in a society where everybody around you's believing something, then, if you're in a little culture of your own, a little clique of your own, you're going to start believing what the clique believes. You know that from high school. Yeah, you're going to go with the clique. What they believe, that's the truth. So yeah, if everybody's thinking, everybody around you is believing in the supernatural, then it must be true. Everybody believes it, so it must be true. Well, you remember your mama said, just because everybody's jumping off a cliff don't mean you should jump off a cliff. Remember, just because everybody believes something is true, that don't make it true. Everybody on the planet could believe something's true, that still wouldn't make it true. You gotta have the proof. You can't just have the belief. Where's your proof? The proof has got to be there in the play. It's got to be in the pudding pie there, the proof. Tell me why pudding pie. It's got to be in that pudding pie. All right, so let's turn to the play within the play. We'll take a brief pause, and it looks like I may be able to finish, but if not, part 3 shouldn't be longer than a half hour or so, but I am determined this is it. This is it. So hang in there, and you can always pause and come back later or tomorrow. After all, tomorrow is another day. So I'm going to pause, and I will return. And I have returned. And before we turn to the play within the play, one last thing about this speech of Theseus is, I think Shakespeare is telling us that, yes, the fairies do exist. The gods do exist. Angels, witches, devils. Yes, they all exist. Ghosts, pixies, elves, they all exist. Heavens, hells, purgatories. All of that. Magical flower juice. It all exists. But it doesn't exist in reality. It exists here, in the brain, in the imagination. These are figments of the romantic viewpoint, figments of the romantic imagination. That's where they exist, ultimately. And that's where they need to stay. They don't need to come out here. They don't need to be spoken. Nobody, unless it's in a fiction, of course, and everybody's saying, let's make believe, which is what Shakespeare's doing here. But he's saying, let's make believe, and ultimately, and again, he's focused primarily on love, but there were, as I've said, the romantic viewpoint is bedrock. I like that. I like saying that. The bedrock of the romantic viewpoint is this belief in the supernatural. How else could we have such notions as true love that will last forever, happily ever after endings, the unions of souls and soulmates, and the crosses to bear. In the end, the forces of good will triumph. All these ideas we've been toying with, these little fairy toys, as Theseus calls them. They are fairy toys, aren't they? They are fairy tale toys that many people just can't put away. Can't put them in the toy box and put them up in the attic. No, you don't have to put them away. You can have those moments of, as I said, when those winds of nostalgia start, the voice of nostalgia starts whispering in your ear. So, yes, that happens to me quite often in the evening. I'll watch a movie from my past. But that's where the supernatural realm exists. The supernatural realm exists in the imagination. And the imagination can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. It's just how you use it, baby. How you use that imagination. So you got to be careful. You got to even keep your imagination. You got to keep the reins of imagination. You got to keep the reins on imagination as well. Always remember, reason should be riding the horse, not the other way around. Or reason shouldn't fall off the horse. That's frightening too. You don't want that horse running wild. Okay, let's see. Let's turn then to the play within the play. And I think what I'm going to do is end this lecture here, because I need a break. So I'm going to end this lecture here, and then I'm going to put up part 3, the final part. The last part should be about an hour, I think I should be done. So I'm going to run about a half hour over the 3-hour mark that I was shooting for. But remember, this is a 5-hour lecture class, so I'm still in under the wire. So at any rate, I will close this lecture here, and begin a new lecture in a couple of hours and put both lectures online tonight. So until then, you may be gone.